Get a... And welcome to episode number 121 of the Showrunner. I am Jared Morris, serial podcast host and eternal believer in the power of balancing pride and humility. And here with me, as always, is my co-host, Johnny Nastor, serial t-shirt wearer, coffee connoisseur, and the host of the world-renowned and best-selling Hack the Entrepreneur. We are your podcasting mentors. Oh, wait a minute. All right, Johnny, I'm going to give you two guesses as to what I just did. What I forgot to do.
You're recording?
Yeah, I forgot to record. Oh yeah, this is live. This is live.
It says recording.
Yeah, this is live for everybody on the video. Yes, but I forgot to do my backup recording.
Oh, for the actual audio.
Yeah, so let me just say, like, for anybody who wants to do the whole, like, you know, broadcasting live and doing all this stuff, there's a lot of things to keep straight. So that is one of them. Is I always want to get the local recording because it's the higher quality one. So that's why I wanted to stop. Anyway, my apologies to everybody who's watching live that had to deal with that. But we're going to start over and do this right because the most important thing is that we get the good recording for the podcast. Okay.
Right.
Here we go. Okay. And starting over in 3, 2, 1. And welcome to episode 121 of the Showrunner. I am Jared Morris, serial podcast host and eternal believer in the power of balancing pride and humility. And here with me, as always, is my co-host, Johnny Nastor, serial t-shirt wearer, even though he's not wearing a t-shirt today, coffee connoisseur, and the host of the world-renowned and best-selling Hack the Entrepreneur. We are your podcasting mentors, excited to be with you for another week of talking about not just how to podcast, but more specifically, how to drive meaningful results from a podcast-centered marketing strategy. And this week, we are using a question from our Showrunner course Facebook group as the inspiration for an entire episode. In fact, this happens often. If you have ever tried to host a remote 2-on-1 interview, then you are almost surely aware of the landmines laying in wait all over the place, from disorganization to verbal car crashes and more. Remote 2-on-1 interviews can be fraught with issues if you don't have a solid strategy for executing them. This week, we highlight 3 of the biggest potential problems and give you strategies for overcoming them. That's coming here on the Showrunner. Before we get to all of that, though, it is time to welcome in my co-host, Johnny Nastor, and we will do so by hitting up the random question generator so that we can learn a little bit more about Mr. Nastor. Here we go. All right, Johnny, here is this week's question. I promise this is the one that just came up when I clicked on this. If you became president, what is the first thing you would do?
I would get rid of the current president.
Well, you would
As a Canadian, yeah. I would become a president of Canada, which we don't have, and I would go directly to Washington, D.C. and get rid of your president. I don't even want to get political, but I want to get back to where politics is like so aside that we pay attention to once every 4 years, not every single day.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do. And I would bring back Twitter feeds and just, I guess every feed could be just talking about celebrities and gossip and weather and nonsense again. So we're not talking about that other nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, we would have a real story if you were elected president, given
especially from Canada.
Yeah. Although with the way things are going, it seems like anything is possible. So maybe that could happen.
It's a wacky question.
It is kind of a wacky question, but it's what came up, and we have to go with what the random question generator generates.
I want to be president now, Jared.
I know. The thought has me kind of excited. Podcasting would definitely become more prominent. That's for sure.
It would.
Okay. Seriously, like if you were president, let me ask you this: how would you use podcasting to like further your platform or to connect with the citizens?
I would do a weekly show,
like a fireside chat type thing, but on a podcast.
I would have to get with my people and talk about the format, and possibly there'd be like 2 or 3 different formats, so it could change up depending on where I was and what I was doing. But fireside chat could be a Q&A, which would be kind of cool, like a mailbag with the president, actually get your stuff answered, and maybe cool. Just like more of an inside look, sort of a what, like maybe like a Gary Vee style, where cameras will just follow me everywhere and everything that's going on, except everything will be redacted around me and like taken back. But something like that.
Now I'm thinking about Gary Vee as president.
Almost better. So yeah, I mean, I think I would use it like a celebrity should use it, like a business should use it, like a person should use it, is to educate about what you are sort of talking about, and then also give people sort of a behind the scenes sort of look, like we get to do with this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you mentioned your people. If you're looking for people when you become president and you need a podcasting czar, I'm available. I'll be willing to help you out.
Sounds good.
All right. So if this is your first time listening to the Showrunner, we want to welcome you. We are glad that you're here. You may find this is not your typical podcast about podcasting, and that is exactly the way that we want it. If you've been with us before, welcome back. We appreciate you being with us again, and we hope to be better today than we were the last time. Now, whether you're a newbie or a grizzled Showrunner veteran, if at any point during your journey with us you decide that you want more, that you want to get serious and take the next step as not just a podcaster, but as a showrunner, we are ready for you. So visit our homepage, showrunner.fm, and drop your email address into the field that you'll see right there at the top of the page. That's the best way to stay connected with us and with the show. And if you ever want to contact us directly, you can just hit reply on one of our emails, ask us a question, and we will be happy to answer. Now, speaking of talking about someone who has made the leap from podcaster to showrunner, Johnny, I want to briefly shine the showrunner spotlight on a longtime listener of ours and a member of our showrunner podcasting course and community, someone whose name that you will recognize, Julie Duffy Dillon.
I'm Julie Duffy Dillon, registered dietitian and partner on your food peace journey. I'm so glad you're here.
Julie is the host of the Love Food podcast, which just completed its second season. And in total, the Love Food podcast has produced 122 episodes over those 2 seasons. In other words, Johnny, Julie has produced one more episode than you and I have produced with the Showrunner. And I would make a little joke here about how maybe we should be learning from Julie, except that it's not a joke. We really should be. And we are, because what Julie is doing next is pretty smart. She and I were just messaging about this today on Facebook, and it's really inspiring. She's actually getting ready to launch a 10-episode capsule podcast. That's what she called a capsule podcast, which I really love that term. And it's called PCOS and Food Peace. And as Julie explained to me, those with PCOS are tortured by diets and weight loss messages. So her message from Love Food is really important yet rare. She has an online course for those affected by it and just designed one for fellow dietitians to use the same message. And as she said, I want this podcast to be a platform to sell these courses. And I love this. So again, after producing 122 episodes of Love Food, a niche health and wellness podcast that targets a higher weight woman with a complicated relationship with food, Julie has discovered a niche within that niche that she can serve on an even more intimate level. So she created these 2 online courses, one for patients, one for dietitians, and is now creating this capsule podcast to provide free information and resources that will then lead people to the course, which is brilliant. Because when women with PCOS go to their podcast apps and search for podcasts about PCOS, what do you think they're going to find? Almost assuredly, Julie's resources. So again, this is our showrunner spotlight. Wanted to shine that on Julie because she continues to just knock it out of the park and be an incredible example for showrunners. Johnny, what are your thoughts on all the things that she's got going on, and especially this new path that she's getting ready to go on?
I agree. I love the path that she's going on too. The capsule episodes is an interesting way to phrase it. I like that. Like it
a capsule podcast.
Yeah, it positions it to me as something higher value than 10 episodes of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I love that Julie has such a clear, not so much a clear path to monetization, which is really, really good, but knowing her metrics, knowing what it is she's going for, which is she knows, like, she can picture the whole funnel. Somebody goes to iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify, types in PCOS, finds her capsule episodes, goes through them, and it leads them to one of 2 courses, depending on who they are. That to me is amazing, right? Sometimes I think that we maybe, like, we want to podcast more so than we know what we want to get out of the podcast when we add it to our content strategy. That is like, there's like an end result, and the podcast itself is fit in perfectly to achieve the result that she's going for, which I absolutely love. There's clarity, there's exact path, and so she can, if things are not working properly, at least then she knows which parts need to be fixed. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Alrighty, so congrats to Julie on 2 seasons and counting of Success with Love Food. Good luck with the new Capsule podcast. You continue to be, as I mentioned, a great example for all showrunners to follow, and we are lucky to have you as part of our community. And if you want to learn more about what Julie is doing, listen to her show, and see her funnel in action, go to juliedillonrd.com. That's juliedillonrd.com. All right, Johnny, now it is time for this week's main topic, and we're going to talk about conducting, as I mentioned before, conducting 2-on-1 interviews that actually work. And, you know, when you're doing Hack the Entrepreneur, you've done 400 and however many episodes. Have you ever done a 2-on-1 interview episode there, or have those always been solo interviews?
Solo.
Okay. So, but you and I have done several of those. We did one with Toby recently. We've done some other ones here on the Showrunner. Have you done any other 2-on-1 interviews in the past other than those?
I haven't. No.
Okay, so this is something, and I want to talk with you before we begin this and dive into 2-on-1 interviews. You know, there are challenges with any type of interview. You know, consistent potential landmines, whether it's a 2-on-1 interview, whether it's a regular interview. But there are some specific challenges that come up with the 2-on-1 remote interview. And you and I have done some on the Showrunner. My show, Podcast on the Brink, I co-host with the guy who founded InsideTheHall.com, Alex. And so pretty much every episode is us doing a 2-on-1 interview. And so we've gotten a lot of experience, you know, kind of going from being real awkward with it at the beginning and not being quite sure and talking over each other when one person was going to talk and not being very organized, to really having a system like nailed down, ironed out for exactly how we want to do it. And I think if you're going to get into doing these remote 2-on-1 interviews, it's really important to be organized with it and to have a strategy. So that's what we're going to talk about in this episode and give you that strategy for how to overcome some of these problems. Before we get into some of the specific problems that you can have with remote 2-on-1 interviews, Johnny, let's just briefly touch on some of the issues that you can have with a remote 2-on-1 interview, with a regular interview, any of them. You know, and some of those include incomplete preparation, where if you just don't prepare enough, you won't know, you know, what questions to ask. You won't really have the context to ask good follow-up questions. It can be a really thin interview. It can be an interview that doesn't really match the expertise of the guest with the desires and the goals of the audience. You know, if you have a host who doesn't listen, that's not good for any type of interview, whether you're by yourself or you're with other people, if you ask bad questions. So just generally speaking, with all of your experience interviewing, what do you think are kind of the 1 or 2 biggest problems that no matter what kind of interview you're doing, you want to make sure that you're avoiding?
Tying back to what I just said about Julie, was having a result in mind before starting, knowing what you want to get out of the interview from your guest for your audience. I think it's like anything. If you set sail without any direction in mind, you're never going to end up where you obviously want to be, because you don't even know where that is. So that's important. And then I'm all about the follow-up questions. And follow-up questions sometimes can be hard they're hard when you're doing it solo, because sometimes we get so bent on going to the next question that we leave something hanging or unfinished. And I think it's more difficult. I find it more difficult with 2 people, because I might have a follow-up question to the response to your question. And you know what I mean? Like I don't think it's natural enough that it should be, I ask a question, now I ask a follow-up, and you ask the next question and ask the next follow-up. I think every first response to your main question deserves a follow-up question. I'm not into following up and following up and following up and going down rabbit holes, but I'm really about, you need to sort of take that down, because that's where the person really gets to open up. And so I think you have to go into the 2-on-1 interview with a plan of action for that, and knowing where. Usually I think people will know, it's like, okay, well, I'll ask this question, you ask this one, I'll ask this one, you ask this one. But then it sort of staggers too much. It's not fluid because of lack of follow-up.
Okay. And that is definitely something that we're going to address, because you may be thinking, okay, if you're doing this 2-on-1 setup, like how do you communicate that? How do you communicate when it's time to follow up? Well, we will give you some strategies for how to do that. And if you're wondering why I keep using the phrase remote 2-on-1 interview, I think it's important that we specify that, because if you're in person, and there's 3 people there, or there's 2 of you and you're there together and you're interviewing one person, maybe over Skype, it's much different because you can look at each other and there are verbal cues that you can give each other. And so the organization part that we're going to talk about is still important, but some of the stumbling over each other, some of those things are alleviated because you have the nonverbal cues that you can give each other. When you're doing this remotely, even if, let's say, Johnny, you and I are doing this on Zoom right now, we can see each other. Like, let's say that we had Toby in here and he was on Zoom too, and we were both interviewing him. Or maybe not Toby. Let's say it's someone that we don't normally interview and, that maybe isn't used to the setup. We would have to be careful using a lot of nonverbal stuff on the video because it might distract the other person who's in here. So even doing that where we could see each other, if we can also see the person that we're interviewing, we're still going to need to have some sort of chat strategy, some other strategy to do it. So that's why I'm being specific here, talking about remote 2-on-1 interviews. This means you and the person who you're hosting the show with and conducting the interview with, you can't see each other, but you're, kind of live on this recording together. So you have to know, when it's, who's going to start it, when's the other person's turn to talk, when you're going to ask a follow-up. Otherwise, it just becomes this giant disorganized mess. So the 3 big problems that I want to address here are lack of organization, verbal car crashes, and lack of flexibility. And as you'll hear, they all kind of, bleed into each other a little bit. But those are the 3 big problems that you've got to solve for, that you've got to have a plan for if you're going to do a 2-on-1 interview. And Johnny, let's start with the first problem, which is lack of organization. And I ran into this. I mean, the first couple times I did these 2-on-1 interviews, I just kind of took it for granted that, just based on kind of the pacing and how the conversation was going, that my co-host and I would kind of understand when to jump in and when not to, and it did not work out very well. So I've learned this very quickly. So a couple of questions that absolutely need to be addressed right from the beginning. Number 1 is, who is the host? So you may have a couple of hosts, there may be 2 of you, but who is the host? And what I mean by that is, who is responsible for opening the interview and who is responsible for closing the interview? And each person could take one, or the same person could do both, but you should know ahead of time how that is going to work, because those can be a couple of places where it becomes especially tricky. So again, this just goes back to being organized, communicating about who's going to take on these roles. Another area that needs to be organized is, what topics are you going to cover? So, we go back to, how do you prepare for an interview? Well, you need to prioritize what are the most important topics to ensure that you cover them. And you should go in with a shared game plan for this, because I may think one thing is really important to cover. You may think a few other things are really important to cover. But if we're not on the same page, you may start asking questions and I'm not sure why you're asking these questions. And it just, you don't want that. You want to be on the same page for how, as Johnny mentioned, for what the goal is, what you really want to get out of the interview. And then what is the general flow of your discussion going to be? So are you simply going to ask your guest questions and get out of the way? Or is the conversation going to be more free flowing and interactive? And one way I would answer this is, does your audience need your expertise and insight in this conversation? Or is your time better served by asking questions, asking good follow-up questions, and getting out of the way? And if you really have some insight that you need to bring, maybe do it, afterwards in a little breakdown of the interview or in a subsequent episode, something like that. But you've only got this guest for a certain amount of time. You want to get a certain amount out of them. And you run the risk, if there's 2 of you and you both feel like you have things to say, that you take up the time that the guest could be having. And you only want to do that if you've planned that and there's a strategic reason to do it, and it's really helping your audience learn more, get more context out of what the guest is saying. So, Johnny, those to me are 3 big areas of organization that need to be talked about, that need to be planned ahead for. Any comments on those or any other areas from an organization standpoint that you think people really need to kind of plan ahead when they're doing a 2-on-1 interview?
With that last point and sort of the general flow, and if it's going to be a free-flowing conversation or if people need your expertise, if that's the case, that's totally cool. But to me, a free-flowing conversation isn't an interview. And so I think you shouldn't be positioning it to a potential guest that way. If that's what it is, if there's three of you going to be just talking about a topic, that's not an interview. That's more of like a roundtable discussion. And guests might be more than willing to join you for that. But they should come in knowing that, because otherwise they have a different goal in mind and they're trying to talk a lot because they figure it's an interview. So you really do need to clarify that. That is literally the goal of what you're trying to do and setting the stage of the format. And so don't confuse those two at all. Roundtable discussions can be amazing, but they need to be positioned as that. They need to be that, and everybody involved needs to know what that is. And I think that there are a lot of places where people muddy the waters between those things, where they only know to call it an interview. And so one host might even be thinking interview and the other person's thinking, well, no, there's three of us. We're all smart. We all know this. We should be discussing it. And it's just, that's where I think it really gets conflicting. If you have two hosts not on the same page, it's a mess, because they're both trying to accomplish something different. And so to me, that's one of the most important things, is just knowing what that is. And obviously there's no way Jared or I could tell you which one is better for you. You can maybe do both in different contexts, but know that and clarify what it is that you're trying to do. I think even in a single solo interview style, I mean, if you want to have more of a free-flowing discussion, that should be brought to the attention of your guest, because it will be better if you guys both are on the same path.
We might need to do a standalone episode about that. That's a great point that you just brought up. That's a really good one. So we talked about problem number one. That is lack of organization. We're going to talk about how to avoid verbal car crashes and how to still be flexible, even though you're kind of doing all of this planning in a remote 2-on-1 interview. That is coming here in a second. I do want to tell you about our podcasting course, and specifically our podcast positioning course, because you may be familiar with our comprehensive podcasting course, which you can find at showrunner.fm. But we now have another course that we recently launched, and it is all about how to position your podcast so that you can actually get heard, build an audience, and actually drive meaningful results with your show. It features a comprehensive set of lessons, detailed worksheets, and several Q&As with me and Johnny, where we get the chance to answer your questions that are specific to your situation. We actually, Johnny, just did the first Q&A, and it was awesome. Some of the questions that we got, some of the conversations we had were really, really great. And the reason why this course is essential and why we put so much time into developing it is that there are 550,000 active podcasts in Apple Podcasts, which is a lot. And all of those shows are a major threat to you building a loyal audience if your show is just like everyone else's. But if you stand out, if you position your show in a smart, strategic way, then the growing number of shows and all the new podcast listeners they're going to bring in actually represent an opportunity, not a threat. But you have to get your positioning right. And we want to help you do it. So for details on how you can get started with this course today, go to showrunner.fm/podcast-positioning to learn more about the course and decide if following our path to creating a unique show that cuts through the noise and really gets heard is right for you. It's currently priced under $100, so it's a low-cost investment that can make a major difference on whether your show launches and fizzles or launches, connects with an audience, and delivers big-time results. Again, go to showrunner.fm/podcast-positioning. All right, Johnny, so we talked about the first big problem with remote 2-on-1 interviews, lack of organization. Let's talk now about what I think most people kind of assume, when you think of a 2-on-1 interview, this is probably the problem that comes to mind first, which is verbal car crashes. And what's a verbal car crash? It's where I'm getting ready to ask a question, but my co-host jumps in because they want to ask a follow-up question. And so we've talked over each other, and then both of us stop, and now there's this awkward silence, and then we don't know who's going to jump in, and literally sometimes it can be like 4 or 5 beats of awkwardness because you keep like trying to jump in and nobody knows, and it's really awkward. And look, if it happens like one time, it's kind of cute, it's kind of funny, whatever. But if it's constantly happening in the interview, it is totally going to take your guests out of the flow. It's totally going to take your audience out of the flow. And it just comes across as exactly what it is, which is a lack of organization, a lack of communication, a lack of professionalism. So how do we avoid these? How do we avoid these verbal car crashes? Well, obviously the first step is to make sure that you're organized. A lot of what we talked about in how you solve problem one is going to help you avoid some of these, but there are some other specific things that you need to do to avoid them. And the most important thing that you have to do is have a system for communicating during the recording. And again, I'm not talking about if you're on a video, nonverbal communications, because if everybody's on a video, that can be distracting. And if people are watching the video and they don't know what your little signs are, and you're, waving your hands and you're doing this, that, and the other, you're going to distract from what's happening. So you want to just have a nice, subtle, private way to communicate. So if you're on Skype, and that's how we record for Podcast on the Brink, just open up a private chat. And now you've got a little private chat, and you can say, okay, over to you, or, I've got a follow-up, or whatever you need to say. You've got that. It's private. The guest can't see it. The audience can't see it. It's just you and your co-host, and it helps keep you organized. If you're using Zencaster or something similar or something else, use whatever. Use GChat, use Slack. Use text messaging if you need to. All that matters is that it's a nice, easy, convenient way for you and your co-host to communicate that won't take you totally out of the flow of the interview, but that'll just help you keep everything organized. And the other thing, in addition to having a method for communication, is to be clear in your communication, because you don't want to make that confusing, and don't leave it to chance, and have a code. So what I mean by not leaving it to chance is, when it's Alex's turn to ask a question on Podcast on the Brink, I always say, over to you. I don't just leave it and let him assume that since I've asked 2 questions, it's his turn. And if I ask a follow-up, or if I know I'm going to ask a follow-up, while the guest is talking, I'll say, hey, I have a follow-up real quick, just so he knows. So we always know who's next. It's clear. You leave nothing to chance. And then having a code is just something that you and your co-host can develop so that it's clear, so that so over to you. I have a follow-up. Alex will always say, over to you, and then wrap, which basically means like, I'm done. So you ask your final question, follow up, whatever, I'm done. And then you can wrap, because we've identified that I'm the host who's going to open and close it. So I can't tell you exactly what the exact code is that you should use, but you and your co-host just need to have a code so that you're clear, so that you know what they're thinking, they know what you're thinking, and there is never a question about who's going to be talking next. And so that means especially communicating on when you have a follow-up and when that follow-up is going to go, because you do want to have follow-ups, but that's the place where you can have the most, the most verbal car crashes occurring. So, Johnny, what else would you say in terms of being able to avoid verbal car crashes in addition to that?
I immediately imagined your co-host rapping, but then I was like, oh, he means wrapping up. Okay, see, that's where clarity comes in. It's like, what, yes. You want to break out into rap at the end of the
WRAPPING. No, if you've heard me rap, and really I hope precious few of you have, that's not something that you ever want to podcast.
Heard you sing. There's an episode where you sing.
Yeah.
3 things. The first one is it's 2018. I can't believe I heard GChat in a conversation. I didn't even know that was actually still a thing.
Still a thing.
That's still amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah. But and they say that because on the assembly call, we used GChat for a long time. Wow. So we don't now, but we did use that. So it just came to mind because those are things that we've used.
This clarity of communication, though. This, like, do you have any follow-ups, or like you just did with me before this? Like, oh, Johnny, do you have anything to add to that? You're the first co-host I've had, and that is like, I wish I had that sort of skill still to do that to you. I don't feel that I do. You have the practice with it, so you're really, really good. And to me, it's like your job as a host of an interview, whether it's a solo interview or with a team, your first job is to make your guest look good, make them sound good, make them awesome, right? But also in there, then, if you're doing it with more co-hosts, your other job is to make your co-hosts also sound good and look awesome. And so having those clear sets of communication, they do that. Like if both of us have the experience I do, or did, especially doing this as a co-host, and we both started, it would have been way more rough. But you had that skill and that knack for making me look good, and like I knew what I was doing, and I could kind of just follow along with you. So it's not always just for like, I like that way of looking at it. Like, I like that I'm trying to make my guests look good, sound good, and be smart, look presented well to my audience. And then also, if you're doing that with your co-host, I think you come in with the right mindset where you're trying to make everyone look good. And so to me, that makes me sort of step back a little bit more, like still part of the conversation, but not wanting to just jump in as soon as I think of something to say, because it's like, that might be good for me, but there's other people involved in this. And my job is to make them look good. So it's not to just interrupt and interject. And then the last point on that is that, as I said, Jared's done this hundreds and hundreds of times, so he's got a ton of experience. I hadn't, but I joined Jared, and Jared already had that experience, and he could bring me in. But as a band analogy, being in a band, when you first start in a band, you don't have those sort of verbal cues, like non-verbal cues of working with each other. Like a drummer and a bass player need to be tight, need to be completely together at all times, or it sucks. But as you do it enough times together, you can start, I can sit down with certain bass players and we could play with any other musicians, and we will just know what each other's going to do. But that comes with skill, right? So this is, again, one of those things that when you see or you hear people doing it and they're really, really, really good at it, they didn't start off really, really, really good at it. It's something that really evolves over time, and you really, really can become good at it. And it becomes where the nonverbal communication can actually start to happen, where you almost naturally, I can almost hear Jared finish certain statements when I just know that the way he's like, his inflection means he's stopping, and I can just join in and it's okay. But it's because we've done it enough times together. And these things do start to come, but they don't come at the beginning. And so that's when you really need a chat window somewhere else, or you need to be able to kick the person under the table if you're in a setting like, and it's just how it works. But as it evolves, you just get better and better and better at it. And then you can almost, well, I mean, as you were talking, I was like, I'm going to Slack him something. As he's talking about Slack, it's like his Slack's not even open. And we're live, but that's just the way it is because we've done it enough times. So now it truly is nonverbal.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It's a little bit harder to communicate privately when you're doing a one-on-one conversation, because it's like I'm talking right now. So if you sent me a message, it would be really distracting for me to read it and still try to make my point. But I do think, just as kind of a side point, these strategies that we're talking about here for avoiding verbal car crashes in a remote 2-on-1 interview can also work really well if you're in a 3-person or more kind of roundtable discussion, because what you don't want to totally eliminate in a group discussion like that is interruptions and interjections, because there are moments of conflict that actually get people like leaning forward. So they're good to have. But if they're happening all the time, it actually lessens the impact of them and totally throws off the flow of the conversation. So it's like when I'm doing the assembly call and I have 2 co-hosts with me, for the most part, while Ryan is talking, I'll ask Andy, I'll just put in the chat, Andy, do you have anything on this? And if he does, as soon as Ryan's done, I'll say, Andy, what are your thoughts? Or I'll write to Andy, just hop in. So that way, when Ryan's done, I'm not saying, hey, and then Andy's jumping in and we're falling all over each other. But what that does, because that's the normal flow, now when Ryan just interrupts or interjects, there's a different, like there's something special about it. Actually, there's not, because Ryan interrupts all the time, but I'm just kidding. But no, you see what I'm saying? Like it's like a moment. So I think no matter what you're doing, you want to try and avoid these verbal car crashes. And even in a one-on-one interview, Johnny, like you just said, there are times when you and I are talking where you're making a point and I want to jump in real quick, or you want to jump in, and we'll do it. But for the most part, we avoid that, and we have ways to transition back and forth to each other. And I think it allows the conversation to flow and allows for those moments where we do jump in to really have their impact. So same thing goes for a remote 2-on-1 interview. It's not that if someone else has asked the question, you have a point that you want to make, that you can never jump in and do it. You just want to be really sure that you jumping in and interrupting the flow is important enough to do it. And maybe it is. That's a judgment you're going to have to make, but it will get your audience's attention. So just make sure that what comes after that was worth breaking up the flow. You just don't want to have it happen all the time, because then the conversation has no flow. So that is problem number 2, which was verbal car crashes. Problem number 1 was lack of organization. Let's talk now, Johnny, about problem number 3, which is lack of flexibility. Because if you kind of do everything that we just said for organization, and then you're really focused on these lack of verbal car crashes, you might think, well, shoot, this is like, everything is going to be so rigid here. This is going to be a really inflexible presentation. And that shouldn't be the case. Now, it can be, even really well-organized 2-on-1 interviews can sometimes have kind of a station-to-station feel about them, which just means ask a question, answer, ask a question, answer. And generally speaking, I think it's good for that to be the case, but you do want to be able to have some flexibility for all the reasons that I just talked about. And this is where you can use the communication methods that we just talked about to give you flexibility. And I think the main place where you want flexibility is with follow-up questions, because you can plan all you want, but you're not necessarily going to be able to plan what question there's a pertinent follow-up to because your guest says something really interesting. And Johnny, I know you said you don't like to go down rabbit holes, but you do always want to at least have one follow-up question to a question because it shows that you're listening. And typically, that guest has said something that is worth following up on if the first question was worth asking in the first place. So this is where you want to be flexible enough to ask follow-up questions, but it shouldn't just be assumed that the person who asks the question is the one who will have the follow. Alex can ask a question and the guest may say something and it, jogs something in my mind, and I'll just write to him, hey, I have a follow on this real quick. And then I can hop in and do it. And so you can have some flexibility that way. And the other thing that you want to make sure that you do is to make sure that you're done with a topic before moving on. Because, the worst thing is, Alex asks a question, or your co-host asks a question, your guest gives an answer to it. And then, Alex might have had something else on that, but you kind of say, I'm going to jump in, and then you ask another question and you're on to another topic. And then if Alex wants to go back to it, he's like, hey, back on that one topic. And now you're just like zigzagging back and forth, but not actually, diving into a topic, addressing it, and then moving on. So use this communication, use your planning to allow for your interview to be flexible, to live and breathe, to go in the places that it should go. But if you've done this and you're organized, it'll have a real flow to it. And that's what you really want. So I've got one more point on this, Johnny, that I want to wrap up on. But when it comes to interview flexibility, what do you think are some of the other most important elements that people planning and doing 2-on-1 interviews really need to think about?
Yeah, it's really those, to me, the flexibility and the follow-up questions. I can't emphasize enough the importance of follow-up questions. And when I say don't go down a rabbit hole, it's because I don't want to get so far off topic. But then interestingly enough, where you say somebody goes on to something else, sometimes I'll have guests who I guess they just get excited and all of a sudden they answer your question and then they've almost answered 2 other questions that you have all in the same thing. They're just so excited. That's done and they just keep talking and you're trying to interject, but you can't, so you let them go. When that happens, sometimes it's it's my job to keep control. So I'll be like, oh, that's awesome. Let's go back though. We need to just, you know what I mean? Sometimes, and usually once we're done, they're just like, wow, I really liked how you really, because then they feel confident that they can just talk about anything and you're going to direct them. Yeah. Otherwise, when it's too well, no one can steer this thing, let's just let it go. That's to me rabbit holes. And then even your guest is kind of what are we talking about? You know what I mean? There's no set thing. And so if they feel that you'll take the reins wherever it needs to go, I like that. And I think any of the hosts can do that if you already know what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so to me, it's just following up because it shows, it brings depth and it may really pull stuff out of your guest usually in that, because sometimes it's a bit of a trite answer the first time, but then if you just repeat even the last 3 things they said, the last 3 words, usually they'll just continue on and go deeper. It's awesome. Now let's move to the next thing. But we know where it is we're trying to get, all of us, so that way I feel even if you ask a follow-up to my question, we still have the same goal in mind. It's not all of a sudden you're just oh, but this guy might know something about basketball. It's dude, we're not talking, but you're just I want to hear what he has to. It's well, that's not our goal. It's oh, okay. So it revolves around there. And I guess moving on when it's time and being but with an interview, even a good interview, you have to be flexible, but also try and get somewhere, know where you're going, but be flexible for your guest to take it slightly off track once in a while, as long as you're bringing it back.
Yes. the guest taking it off track, not your co-host taking it off track. That's the main thing, is you want to be flexible when your guest does, but have the organization to where you're not pulling it in different directions. And that goes back to organization, just being organized between you and your co-host. Here's the other thing that I will say on this, on just the general flow for these remote 2-on-1 interviews, is it is really important to set egos aside. And if you're not willing to set your ego aside at times, maybe even half the time for the interview, why are you doing it with two people? Like literally, why aren't you just doing the whole interview yourself? Okay. So where can this be a problem? Well, let's say that you've, prepared some questions and you have some questions you've really worked on. You love the wording of these questions and you really want to be the one that addresses this topic, but your co-host ask the question on that. And you're spending the whole time listening to him ask this question. And you're just thinking, man, all right, I wanted to ask this question. I had a really good question. Like the way that I phrased this is really good. And I kind of wanted to be the one to lead this part of the discussion. And you can, just get so worked up and you get yourself out of the flow of the interview and you're not listening to the guest. And, and what are you going to do? You're going to hop in and interrupt and be like, no, I got this. Let me ask this question. Like, you're not going to do that. Right. And I say this and I speak from personal experience because I do like to pre-write out some of my questions sometimes. I don't always ask them that way, but it does allow me to at least kind of get the flow for how I want the question to go. And there have been some times, Alex will ask a question and, I'll kind of think to myself, crap, I wanted to be the one to ask that. But I've got to set my ego aside and allow that part of the conversation to run. And I'll listen. And then if I have a good follow-up, then maybe I can let Alex know that I have a follow-up. But if I'm not willing to do that, and if that's really going to frustrate me, and if I'm going to then try to re-ask the same question again just because I have to get it in, why am I doing this show with a co-host? Why wouldn't I just do it by myself? So that's one example. There are several others. I mean, you're just going to get less airtime in this conversation if you have a co-host. So I would say if you're going to do these 2-on-1 remote interviews, make sure that you've thought it out and that there's a real reason for there to be two people there instead of just one. And if this is the decision that you've made, set your ego aside and do what is best for the interview. Take on the perspective of your audience. And when it's not your turn to talk, put yourself in the audience's shoes and kind of listen as they're listening. And whatever follow-up questions they might have, because you have them, that's maybe now how you can step in and provide some value here. But don't let your ego get wounded because this is the topic you wanted to talk about, or he's, hogging this airtime, whatever. You've got to be the advocate for your audience. And if you're only thinking about yourself or if your ego is taking over, you're not going to be doing that. So, that kind of fits into all of these and flexibility and organization, all of that. But I just think it's really important to remember that, to be compassionate with yourself if it happens, because if we're podcasters, we like to talk, we like to be in these conversations. So there probably will be times where you wish it was you talking and it's not. Just put your ego aside and do what's best for the audience, do what's best for the interview, and you can't really go wrong.
Your goal should be to make your guest and your co-hosts look awesome.
That's right.
And think about them over you.
Yeah. And what's funny is if you do that, it makes you look good too.
It does. It really does. And especially if all of you are approaching it with that. It's not just you like, okay, well, they can focus on themselves, but you have to make sure they look good. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. Like, don't be the sidekick. But if everybody's trying to make each other look good, I think you'll come at it with a lot better, I guess, with more humility and more of the approach that the job is to make the interview good, not me good.
Yep. Great way to wrap it up. Again, just to recap, the three big problems with remote 2-on-1 interviews: lack of organization, verbal car crashes, lack of flexibility. Communication helps so much of this. Communication before the interview in terms of your planning, communication during the interview in terms of who wants to talk next, who has a follow-up to avoid the verbal car crashes, and even communication afterwards. This can help your overall flexibility as you go and just the overall health of your partnership doing these interviews, to make sure that you communicate and so that you know what the goals are and you guys are on the same page moving forward. And when you do that, you can have a lot of success with these remote 2-on-1 interviews, because when they're done well, they can be really, really good because you have these additional perspectives that you bring to the conversation, and that can be good for the audience. audience if everybody's on the same page. Alrighty, well, thank you for joining us for another week of talking about how to drive meaningful results from a podcast-centered marketing strategy. If you want more from us, if you want to join one of our courses, if you want to view our show archive, if you want to get on our email list, we are ready for you. Just visit showrunner.fm and you will find what you are looking for. We will be back with another brand new episode next week. We hope that you'll be here with us. Until then, be authentic, be useful, and keep showing up. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
All right.
Be authentic, be useful, and keep showing up.
You like that?
I like that. I do like
that. All right. Now back to thinking about Johnny Nasser as president. If anybody, we'll hang around for another minute or so. So if anybody has a question that you'd like us to address, post it in Facebook or on YouTube. And after that, we will head on out and I'll get this posted. I like getting these posted right after we do them. Of course, we'll have to see if my daughter allows me to get it posted. I may have to take a little break and run her over to daycare before I actually get it posted. Do you want to know what the next question on the random question generator was if it hadn't been the president question?
Yes.
Where did you grow up?
Oh.
See, the other one was better.
I haven't.
Great answer. That's awesome. And good, because growing up is overrated anyway.
Exactly. I agree. Just like presidencies are overrated too.
Oh, man.
Wow. Studio Press, man.
Studio Press. I know.
Wow.
Acquired.
I know. Amazing.
I know. It's awesome for Studio Press.
That is awesome. Yeah, it's super cool.
It is.
Wow. Surprised me. I was like, whoa. I was standing in line at a coffee shop and I saw Brian Gardner tweet it out. It's like, whoa, that's awesome.
I know. It is awesome.
Cool. Yeah.
It is awesome. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see kind of what that means for the long term. But
yeah,
I mean, overall, it's going to be good. You know, I mean, because WP Engine has really grown as a company, and
they're a great company. Well, I don't know,
they've
but
got a lot of resources.
Yeah, they do. I know their product, like WP Engine itself, is amazing. So they know what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think it'll be good for hosting. I mean, I was talking with some hosting customers earlier today. You know, like people who've been with us way back when we launched Synthesis, which, you know, eventually kind of became Rainmakers Hosting. That's how I joined Copyblogger in the first place. You know, and they were kind of asking about it. And it's, you know, like Studio Press Sites hosting was awesome. Like it is awesome. Matt did such a good job with it. But the thing about going to WP Engine is now it's with a company that like all they do is hosting. And as good as Studio Press Sites hosting was, you know, as you project that forward, I think it still would have been good. But, you know, it's Rainmaker Digital Copyblogger is a company that does a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And I think the focus and the manpower that WP Engine has will be a real positive for.
And it's only WordPress hosting, right?
Are they only WordPress hosting now? WP Engine? Oh, all right. That was the dumbest question I've asked in a long time.
Well, I was thinking myself, I was going to say that, but then I was like, well, it's WP Engine. They must be. I only know them as managed hosting for WordPress. That's all I know.
That's got to be what it is.
It's a strange name.
Maybe it's like wild party hosting.
Wild party host engine.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Well, yeah. Cool, man. All right. I see no questions.
Okay.
So let me go see if I can get this posted before she wakes up.
Sounds good, man.
I'll talk to you on Slack.
Take
or
care.
GChat if you'd rather talk on GChat.
Yeah.
See you, man. Bye, everybody.